I guess the biggest question is who's going to have a great chance in at least coming into the first round, get the ticket for the second round. Mr. Godement, you want to go first?
Sure. First of all, the polls are constantly moving. The last one is slightly lower for Mrs. Le Pen, but she still comes on first. And Mr. Fillon just pulls slightly ahead of Mr. Macron, but of course it means nothing in the long term. I think the voters are going to have to decide on personality issues for the first round. Mr. Fillon originally had the lead, but his wife and children's employment have created problems. Are the voters going to think that this is incidental or that this is fundamental? We live in a presidential system in France, largely presidential, but now the personality of both the sitting president, Mr. Hollande, and the personality of candidates is being watched as never before.
Okay. Mr. Lequesne, let me go to you about that. What do you say at this point? Because Ms. Le Pen, even though she seemed to lead the polls by small margin, her campaign headquarters was raided and there was suspicion, some of the officials there related to so-called connections with Russia and whether there is another country meddling with your election. Whether Russia admit that or not is another question, but what about her chance as a result of this?
I think you have to separate.
Let's go to
Mr.
Lequesne, please.
Okay.
Yes, on the question of the relationship with Russia, yes, we know perfectly well that the party of Mrs. Le Pen has very good relationship with Russia, and we had the proof that some Russian banks subsidized the party a couple of months ago, so no doubt about that. On the chance of Madame Le Pen to be qualified at the second round, well, I think they are high. She has very good chances to be one of the two candidates who is going to be in the race for the presidential election. So it's the first time, I think, in the history of the Fifth Republic, starting in 1958, that we cannot exclude that a right-wing candidate could win this election.
Okay. Mr. Godement, really, Ms. Le Pen's campaign has links to Russia?
Well, it's clear that she's in the pro-Russia camp, that she has been visiting Russia. It's clear that she sought credit financing from Russia. This time, apparently, she's not getting it. It's her own father who is lending to her for the campaign. Yes, the suspicion is there. And generally, Russia doesn't have an interest in fostering or supporting, shall we say, center parties or moderate parties. But that's not the main factor for European voters. I think that for French voters, the main factor is going to be the extent of their discontent and how much they feel represented by Mrs. Le Pen, who, by the way, is a very good campaigner personally, and even manages to come across as somebody who is not that mean, who is not that brutal. It's a kind of contrarian image that she has, that she manages to give. So that is perhaps her strongest asset, her personality.
Mr. Godement, I want to go further about that. Mrs. Le Pen have the tendency of linking herself and her campaign with the victory of President Trump in the United States. Some say it's a plus, some say rather it could be a minus because of what Mr. Trump's rhetoric and also the European views about America now. What do you say?
Well, she's, of course, just as she's trying to gain legitimacy from Brexit, saying, you know, we could have Frexit, France leaving the EU since the UK is leaving the EU, she's, of course, trying to gain from Donald Trump's election. But you just need to spend 5 minutes looking at American political rallies or French political rallies, including Donald Trump's rallies and Marine Le Pen's, by the way, to see how the two societies are different. American politics are raw, they're crude, what is called fake news, and violent social media is everywhere. I'm not saying it does not exist in France, but not for overt social media. Not even the far-right social media are anywhere near what exists in the US.
Do you agree with that?
And really, the danger in what she's doing is that the French voters will think Mr. Trump is just highly dangerous to himself, to his own country, and it will work as a bad precedent to them.
Mr. Lequesne, what about your views on that? Mrs. Le Pen is a much better version of Mr. Trump if we're talking about a black swan opportunity or possibility?
Well, I don't know if she's a better version. She's probably a French version. First of all, we shall never forget that the people who are interested in this kind of candidate, they do not look so much at what is going on in the other countries. They are very much concentrated on the national scene, and I don't think that for the people who are decided to vote for Le Pen, what Trump is doing is important, you know. They want to have somebody in the national context of France because they want to change politics in France, and they don't believe in traditional political parties anymore. So this question of doing a comparison, you know, with what is going on in the other part of the world is something we analysts, we are doing all the time. But I'm not sure that the electorate is acting in the same way.
That's a great point over there. Mr. Godement, another question, also extremely important. That is, what's going to be France's role on the European continent? Of course, Mr. Lequesne just now helped us to understand, for those voters, they don't care. But from your perspective, this election, many say, could be very crucial for France's relations with the European continent. What do you think France's future is? And how much will that debate filter into the final election result?
Well, there's no question that the election will have consequences for Europe either way. You have several candidates who essentially campaign on the basis of opposing Europe, both far right and far left. Very few argue for a really stronger Europe. Perhaps Mr. Macron is the only one who does it rather consistently. And to some extent, the conservative candidate, Mr. Fillon, also does it with big nuances because he wants essentially European governments to take back from the Commission, from the European Commission, some of its power. The main issue is going to be, frankly, how do we manage our public debt? Do we keep spending, overspending in our budget given the load of debt that France has? Or do we cut spending? And that, of course, is something that the voters are very sensitive to. And that is something that our neighbors, either our neighbors in Southern Europe, who've actually expended quite a bit of effort to reduce that debt, or Germany, are very sensitive to.
Right. Mr. Lequesne, what do you think about the relations between France and Europe? And how would that, in a way, and the possible consequences of this election, at this point, filter into the debate leading up to the election?
Well, we are at a point where we need, of course, to reform Europe, no doubt about that, because we had a series of crises starting in 2008 with the economic crisis, then we had the refugee crisis, and then we had the Brexit. So it's absolutely crucial that we have, after the French but also the German election, a moment where the leaders of Europe decide to know and to see what they want to do with the future of Europe. If we have somebody like Macron or even Fillon elected in France, and if Mrs. Merkel is re-elected, but it could be also Mr. Scholz, because he's very European, he has been for years the president of the European Parliament. Well, in this case, we can have a Franco-German maybe not initiative, but compromise on the future. If we have Le Pen, of course, nothing will be possible. So in this case, it will not be possible to reform Europe. France is not Hungary, you know. Mr. Orban, of course, he has a possibility to block the system, but is not decisive when the president of France is representing a big country. So it would be a catastrophe.
At this point, the French leader is visiting China. Of course, he only have a few months to go in the office. But certainly in this part of the world, we are looking at the situation very closely. There's another point that's so interesting about this election. That is, there are quite a number of new faces, isn't it? I mean, Mrs. Le Pen is one of them, and Mr. Macron is another. Even though they come from very different tracks, fresh faces always important in an election in which voters seek to have a different path for the future of the country. Will they be able to convince the voters that they are the future and they are different? That is a very crucial question. Mr. Lequesne, at this point, who do you think is doing a good job or a better job? And is Mr. Macron, who seemed to have some potential, going to really survive the first round? That's a lot of concerns about him at this point.
Well, very difficult to answer this question. I mean, well, it's an issue, of course. But you're absolutely right. One of the advantages of Macron is that he is a new figure. He's not somebody who is coming from the traditional parties, you know. Well, he was Minister of Economics, of course, but he decided to leave the government, etc. So he's not somebody we saw already in many elections in the past, etc. And this is a problem of the French system. We have a problem to produce new political elites, probably a structural problem linked to the way parties functioned in France. So for young people, for people who want to have some change, of course Macron is representing something new.
Well,
the big question now is, could you win an election if you do not have a party structure? Because this is exactly
very interesting issue over there for Mr. Macron, and also he has so many stories, of course. Already the media tapped into it about his personal life. Those are going to shine as well for an election these days with social media so well developed. Before we go, Mr. Godement, very briefly, 30 seconds for you. The most important thing is whether the voters will come out. We saw that they didn't come out, only 49% of Americans for the last election. What about French, very briefly?
No, French politics are very different. Less than half of the people vote in the US. In France, especially for the presidential election, you can count on literally 80% of the people voting. What might happen in a second round, and that might determine the second round, is that on one side some people stay home because they really cannot stomach either candidates, while on the other side they mobilize a bit more. But frankly, France loves politics.